Welcome, everyone, to Circle City Conversations. Thank you for joining me for our conversation today. Thank you to our sponsor, Hurst, Limontes, an Indiana law firm representing Hoosiers and their families for over 50 years. We launched episode 1 a few months ago, and since then we've had some great guests and some wonderful conversations. I'd like to thank everyone for their continued support. I'm excited to introduce my guest today, a true jack of all trades, I would say, most importantly, a father and a husband, excellent trial lawyer, fantastic mediator, high school debate team coach, regular concert goer, a stand-up comedian, and my friend Mike Langford. I've known Mike for a long time. Mike, thanks for being here.
You bet, Alex. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So we usually start real easy. We want everyone to kind of get to know you a little bit. So tell us a little bit about where you're from and where you went to school.
You bet. So I grew up in Newcastle, Indiana, home of the world's largest high school gym. Believe it or not, in a town of 20,000 people when I was growing up there in the 1970s and 80s, it sat 10,000.
Wow.
And it was not unusual whatsoever that on Friday and Saturday nights, that gym was completely sold out. We had Mr. Basketball's Kent Benson in 1973 and Steve Alford in 1983. And it was a wonderful community to grow up in. The name of my high school was Newcastle Chrysler High School, named after the Chrysler factory that was in town. We were that much of a factory town that we actually named our high school. We gave them naming rights without any money exchanged, way before anybody was ever doing that. But so I grew up. My dad was a high school math teacher. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I was myself and 2 sisters. Very nice growing up. We weren't wealthy by any means on a teacher's salary, probably making between $30,000 to $40,000 depending on the year. Maintaining a family of 5, but we took lots of trips to places like Kings Island, the Smoky Mountains, and life was good. In high school, in addition to various sports activities, I got involved with the high school speech and debate team, and in great part because of the coaches that we had. It was a very nice team. We did well, but I also scratched my head and said, wait a second, I can read, I can write, I can research, I can argue, I can hang out with very interesting people, and I get paid for this? This looks interesting. So that was sort of the beginning of my thoughts about, hey, maybe I ought to think about law as a career. So after graduating from Newcastle Chrysler High School, I went to Wabash College. I was an English major and a rhetoric minor. That then led me to law school at Indiana University in Bloomington, and then ultimately led to what now has been a 3-decade litigation.
3 decades.
Right.
Wow. Wabash.
Makes me feel old, too.
Wabash, what's the mascot there?
We are the Little Giants.
The Little Giants.
Yes, an oxymoron for sure.
But what's Wally? Who's Wally Wabash?
Yeah, well, that's the mascot. Is affectionately known as Wally. Yeah.
Oh,
right,
okay.
Right.
Okay, but the official mascot is the Little Giants.
Right. The legend goes, and this goes back about 100 years ago, Wabash used to play, among others, Notre Dame and Purdue.
Yeah.
And a Purdue sports writer made remarks about, look at those little giants, because we were a small school that were doing well on the football field. So everyone said, little giants, that's it. So that's what we've been ever since.
That's funny. Who's the big rivals? DePaul, right?
Right. And they play the Monon Bell. It's the longest football rivalry west of the Alleghenies. Wow. I've sort of lost track of how many years, but something like 125 years going back.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I've actually had a lot of DePaul guests on here.
I'm sorry.
I'm a Hanover guy. I think you know that.
I do know that.
Yeah. So Wabash is in Crawfordsville, Indiana. What was like the restaurant that you guys would go to when you were there? Like, maybe when you had a little too much, And
sure. It was the Waffle House. And there weren't a lot of choices. This even predates Taco Bell and some of the other chain restaurants. There were not a lot of options in Crawfordsville when I was there. There was a mall, interestingly.
Really?
Big Lots and Target were sort of the anchors of the mall. But Waffle House was the go-to.
Yeah. So that's a small school. You went from and I went from a small school to a bigger school. Then you went to IU.
I did.
What was that kind of transition like?
It was a good transition, and it was purposeful. I went to Wabash because again, I was sort of in my mind at age 17, not super cultured. Certainly, I was not thinking about private schools out east or anything along those lines. I was mostly thinking Midwest and something that my parents could afford and or I could afford or had scholarship opportunities. It seemed to me that when I looked around my community of Newcastle, that a lot of the lawyers at that point had graduated from Wabash.
Okay.
And I had heard, read, been advised that whatever you do in undergrad, make sure that it's a major that you could do well in, that you would enjoy, that you can excel in, so your GPA could be decent. And then finally, that you would have a lot of exposure to reading and writing. And at least in my 18-year-old mind at the time, I thought, well, maybe a liberal arts school would make sense. And it did make sense. I made a lot of bad decisions when I was 18, no doubt about it. But that was actually a pretty good decision. So back to your question. So I purposely chose a smaller liberal arts school with Wabash, and I purposely chose a larger school because I wanted to have that other feeling after being from Newcastle, a town of 20,000, to Crawfordsville, a town of about 15,000, very similar kind of communities. I was ready for a little something different. And Bloomington, Indiana, and certainly a campus with 40,000 students brought that. So it allowed me to experience Big Ten sports, probably have more cultural opportunities. It was a good vibe. And also we went, obviously, from a single-sex school at Wabash, which it still is, to a co-ed school at Indiana University. And I'll just simply say that was purposeful as well.
I bet. I bet. So you went to law school, graduated from law school. Did you know you wanted to practice here in Indiana?
Not necessarily, but probably. I'm not sure that I entered law school thinking, well, then my ultimate goal is to come to Indianapolis. But, when you grow up in rural Indiana or even in a smaller factory town like I did, Indianapolis is sort of that big city. It's the place where you went to shop if you really wanted to impress a date with a restaurant after prom, certainly the big sporting events and concerts. That's the place you went. So I always had great affection for Indianapolis. If the right firm had come along and said, Raleigh, North Carolina is the place for you, I'm sure I would have listened. But it felt natural for me to end up in Indianapolis.
Yeah. And I mean, you've litigated across the country, right?
I have.
You have. So let's talk about the early days of your career. What was that like after you graduated from law school? Where'd you end up working?
So I law clerked actually between my second and third year with a firm that was then known as Scopolitas, Garvin, Light, and Hansen. And they have an interesting background that actually there used to be a firm in the 1970s in Indianapolis called Summer, Barnard, and Scopolitas.
Yep.
And in 1978, Alki Scopolitas and his young associate, Norm Garvin, decided to go start their own firm. And so they did in 1978. At that point, trucking was heavily regulated. So mostly from 1978 till the early 1990s, the firm's engagement was on the regulatory aspect of trucking, which kept them super busy. Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, to get to be able to travel from Indianapolis to Fort Wayne, it was regulated, and you had to go show the ICC that actually there were reasons, economic reasons, why that lane needed more trucking companies trafficking those lanes, and so you'd bring shippers in to testify. And it was a whole cottage industry, and that's a lot of what the firm did, in addition to getting certain regulatory licenses and some tax matters. They then got into the safety aspect, workers' comp, tax. But then what happened is right around the time that I was hired by Scopolitas in 1993, they were starting to expand and become more broad-based as a firm, in part because this regulatory practice dried up. In 1995, there was a congressional act that was passed, and that ended regulation of trucking companies at a state level, which is what it had been. Okay. And when Ronald Reagan came in, he deregulated trucking at a federal level. In 1995, the Airport Improvement Act, I think it was called, deregulated at a state level. So the firm needed to expand and to be more broad-based, but still keep some of the same clients. And so that's a long wind-up to this short delivery. They needed more litigators because litigation, trucking accidents, insurance coverage matters, commercial disputes, involving our clients seemed to be growing. And so it was truly an example of right place, right time. And so I started in litigation. I knew I always wanted to be in the courtroom, influenced by Atticus Finch and some of the others, Matlock and some of the other icons of the courtroom, but also real figures as well. It influenced me to say, I don't want to be the guy who just sits behind the desk, who just does contracts all day, who does real estate closings. Not that those aren't terrific practices for the right people. I just wasn't the right person.
Right.
I knew I wanted to do opening statement and closing arguments and cross-examination and all that sexy stuff. And from my speech and debate background, I knew it was something that I enjoyed. So that then led this guy who was a fairly newbie attorney at year 2, 3, and 4 to start trying a lot of cases. Two things. One, more jury trials used to get tried. They just did in the 1990s. Now, if you talk to the old dogs that were trying cases in the 70s and 80s, they'll talk about you rolling up their sleeves every weekend to try another jury trial. That wasn't quite my life, but it was the world where maybe you might try 6 to 10 cases a year. And that is what I did for several years. And in part because there weren't many others in the firm that were in litigation because it was a growing practice. So that then led, with a little bit of success and maybe some clients that like you hope along the way, you could kind of grow the practice, had some good results, I guess, in Indiana that then caused clients to say, hey, if you can do that in Indiana, we'd like to move you to some of these other venues where maybe we don't have the right defense attorney on the case. And so that led me to, I think I've tried cases in 12 different states, probably litigated, I would say, in half of the states. And that's a great experience as well.
As far as trying cases, and we've litigated with each other, I guess I'm aging myself now too.
Right.
Even though you do have a full head of hair, Mike, and I don't.
To date. Hang on.
So as far as trying cases, what was your favorite part of trial?
Probably closing argument, because closing argument was that moment where it all came together. And truth be told, that when I would get a new case, probably inside the first month, I would start crafting, at least in my mind, and then sometime on paper, and then typing up closing arguments. Because closing argument is that moment where all of the evidence and all of the work comes together in that final half hour to 1 hour. I think it's the most exciting part of the trial. And finally, you're so restricted throughout a jury trial, restricted by the rules, restricted by the judge from making all the arguments. In opening statement, you've got to just recite the facts, right? Yeah. No argument given. When you're doing either direct or cross-examination of the witnesses, you're restricted by the rules of evidence as to what you can ask. And you also need to be relevant as to that particular witness. But closing argument is in many ways a blank canvas. Yeah. And it's your term, really, it's your moment as a litigator to really bring it all together. So it's awfully tough to closing argument. I'll also say I did a lot of appellate work as well. Sometimes, frankly, because I lost the case and I needed to appeal. But other times, maybe I was brought in to help with the appeal. And I'm an okay writer, but often there were people in my firm that would do the writing, but I would always do the oral arguments. Yeah. And so in addition to closing argument at trial, probably the second part that I missed the most about litigation and the part that I really enjoyed in litigation was the appellate advocacy, the oral arguments before the Indiana Supreme Court, the Indiana Court of Appeals, the Seventh Circuit. There were a couple other circuit courts of appeals where I argued. I enjoy the jousting, the going back and forth.
You do?
And perhaps that is back to that debate background.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like the closest thing to what I used to do in high school with speech and debate, and I now teach high school students. It's the closest thing to debate competition. Yeah. And I really enjoy the intellectual jousting that comes with that. Plus, if I was the trial lawyer, I probably knew the record better than anyone in the room, certainly the judges or the justices who are just getting familiar with the case. And so it's kind of fun to be the expert on the very case that's being talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great how you start with your closing, start crafting and kind of work from there and even almost kind of work backwards.
Yeah. And of course, as we both know, 90% of those cases never get to closing argument because they settle.
Right.
But I do think for purposes of your letters to your clients as an attorney, conversations with your clients, preparing for mediation, settlement negotiations, having those themes always in your mind is really helpful throughout the entire litigation process, knowing what your closing argument would look like if you ever have that opportunity.
Right, absolutely. And you can continue with that theme in all communications, right?
Right.
Even with the other side. So you did litigation for how long?
27 and a half years, I think.
And then you decided to stop.
I did. We all had our moments in COVID. I never had COVID, but I certainly was a part of the pandemic like all other human beings throughout the entire world. And one of the things that happened in March of 2020, as we all know, is that we all sort of just stopped. Mm-hmm. And I was on a very fast treadmill all of the time. And anyone who's an active litigator I know can relate. And there's lots of jobs beyond being an active litigator where one of my struggles was that to do the job well, you had to be thinking about it all the time. You're in the shower, you're at dinner with your family. I mean, you're on your commute, you're watching a sporting event, you're still thinking about that case and that deposition you have the next day. And should you ask it this way or that way? And frankly, it's an overly used term, burnout. So I won't use that term. I will just say I realized that when things slowed down in the spring of 2021, I was exhausted. And I wasn't just exhausted with lawyering. That I actually was fine with. But I was sort of exhausted with always being on. And maybe this is a character fault of mine, that maybe I should have done a better job of compartmentalizing. Right. It's just sometimes tough to do. And so I had conversations in the past with some members of the Mediation Group, principally Neil Biemendorfer, where Neil had kindly said to me years before, if you ever get to a point where you might be interested in mediating, I think you might be pretty good at it, come talk to me. So around this moment where I kind of slowed down and said, okay, let's think about what my next couple decades of my career look like. It gave me a moment to go back to those conversations I'd had with Neil. We continued those conversations. And so I had reached the point where I was ready for a break. I like mediation. You know, the best part about mediation to me is the best part about the practice of law: intellectual challenge and collegiality. Yep. Those are the two best parts, in my opinion, about the practice of law. And son of a gun, if those aren't the two best parts about mediation as well. Yeah. So I kind of felt like what I liked there would translate to what I like in mediation. So that's a kind of where my mind took me at the time in 2021 when I decided to do that move. A lot of people said to me, or they said, I bet you'll come back. Or they asked me at the time, do you think you'll come back? And my answer then is the same as my answer now. As much as I enjoy mediation, and I do, there's parts of being an advocate all the time and being a lawyer that I do miss. Yeah. When I think about I've given my last closing argument or my last appellate advocacy moment, I'm not so sure. So We'll see.
Right. That's funny. So what would you say? Well, no, I guess you did answer that question. Do you think just being on all the time versus being able to turn it off, that maybe is the biggest difference between being a mediator and a trial lawyer? Yes.
That's probably the single biggest difference. The fact that you don't, I live with these cases for as long as the mediation, I get the submission sometimes the day before. So the earliest I can live with the case is when I'm reading the submissions. The last that I have with the case is either at the end of the mediation if it successfully concludes, or perhaps some follow-ups if it doesn't. But it doesn't have a lifespan for me of years and years like some of these cases do. And so that is a big difference. I've gone from living with cases for years to living with the case for maybe as short as a day. The other big difference is, and I'll tell you, Alex, it's kind of freeing, is that when you are an attorney and you are told this is the side you represent, we all have biases. One of the biases we have is what I refer to as advocacy bias. We see things through the lens that we want to see things through. another term that sometimes is applicable is confirmation bias.
Yes.
There's a lot of confirmation bias that happens in our life. There's a lot of confirmation bias that happens inside the handling of litigation. It's been very freeing to be a mediator, where I suppose my only bias is that I am biased towards trying to find a resolution because that's what I think the parties want me to do. But it's not nearly like advocacy bias. And so, when I go into a room and someone's sharing with me why they think they're going to win the case and why the other side is going to lose the case, sometimes I'll say, I think you're exactly right. That's how I see it. Sometimes I'll say, I see it that way, but not completely. And other times I will, hopefully in a polite mediator way, say, I think you're all wet on this one, and let me tell you why. And it's very freeing because it's like for the first moment in my legal career, I can say the heck with which side I represent. Right. Here's just my opinion.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you made that transition from being a full-time litigator to mediator. What piece of advice would you give to someone that's thinking about doing that?
Well, I get asked the question a lot, and frankly, I sometimes get asked the question from folks who are still in law school or have only practiced for a year or two. Yeah. And I say to them with great candor, no one's probably going to hire a 28-year-old mediator, as talented as you might be. So here's my advice. Number one, go practice for at least a couple of decades. Number two, go try some cases. Because what you're doing in mediation is you are talking to clients about the benefits and the risk and rewards of settlement versus the benefits and the risk and rewards of trial. Yeah. And if you never experienced trial yourself, how can you speak with any level of credibility about that point? So I think a good mediator is someone who knows the courtroom, knows how judges and juries think, and can speak with a level of credibility about that. And I think it would be difficult for a non-litigator to be a super successful mediator. There might be some occasional examples of that, but I think as a matter of credibility and experience, that's important. Another piece of advice I have is remember the very lawyers that you are litigating against now are your future clients if you want to be a mediator. So I think we should all be civil. And we should all be professional, and we should all treat this as a job that we're all just trying to do the best we can inside the professional rules of conduct. But don't be a scorched earther. Don't be a difficult person. Don't make snide comments. Because people will remember that, and then they won't hire you. So my advice, in sum, to someone who wants to get in litigation or in mediation, whether it's 30 years from now or very soon, is evaluate, have you done a good job of acquiring the requisite experience so that you have credibility? Have you been kind, and have you been social, and have you been a good person with those people that you've litigated? And then third and finally, understanding that you're starting something completely new. And you don't just suddenly go from being a litigator to having 200 mediations a year. It takes some buildup, and you have to be patient with yourself. And that's been a good experience for me, too. Yeah,
I think that's a great piece of it. I like to ask all the litigators and lawyers that come on the show about what a lot of people have a case that kind of pops up in their mind, something that always sticks with. So if there was one case that was maybe a wild fact pattern or a crazy case or something crazy happened at trial, just tell me that story.
Well, this case, actually, the one that comes to mind was not a case that I actually tried. We ended up settling it, but the fact patterns were sort of crazy and actually led to television appearances. I was a 29-year-old attorney, and the quick story that leads up to this is that a case had been handed from another firm to our firm, from another attorney down to me as sort of the low guy in the totem pole. And it was a Family Medical and Leave Act claim where I was representing a plaintiff against the city. And at this point, the FMLA was a few years old. Nobody really knew much about it. I knew about it from law school, but I'd certainly never handled a case. I met with the potential client. I liked her. I thought her story was pretty compelling. I went and looked at the law, compared it against what she had shared with me, and I thought, well, I don't know much, but I do think that maybe she's got something here. Yeah. I also know I'm new. I'm willing to try new stuff. Yeah. Let's do this. And so what ultimately happened is we went and tried a case. in federal court in Lafayette, and we won the case. And it was against the city of West Lafayette. It was an FMLA claim, and to my knowledge, was the first jury verdict in Indiana in an FMLA claim. And it was a six-figure verdict, $144,000 or something like that. And it made all the headlines in the local newspapers. And so what ultimately happened was I got a lot of phone calls from everyone who'd been let go or fired thinking they too had a claim. Most people don't, as it turns out, under Indiana law. But the rest of that story is that woman that I represented, that I took the flyer on, lived next door to a lovely family. And this is, I'll sort of give the precursor that this is a difficult fact pattern, but this lovely couple had two young adult children. And one of the young adult children lived in Illinois. She brought her then boyfriend over to visit mom and dad in Lafayette, spend the weekend. They had a nice weekend together. And then the plan was that they were going to go to a park, have a hike on a Sunday afternoon, and then the daughter and her boyfriend would then travel back to Illinois. Well, on their way to this park, they were driving because they were going to leave separately. They were driving mom and dad in front car, their daughter and her boyfriend in the car behind them. It's a beautiful Sunday, March afternoon, 1999. And they are on a state road in Lafayette. And along comes a pickup truck that appears to be driving erratically. And as it turns out, this erratic pickup truck crosses the center line, and mom and dad move way over to the side of the road. It clips their vehicle, and then the vehicles move on. The pickup truck goes back to the correct side of the road and then comes across the roadway again. And mom and dad, through the side mirrors and rear view mirrors, watch this pickup truck hit head on their daughter and boyfriend. And the cars blow up. Yeah. It's horrific. They turn around, they go, they try to do whatever they can. Everybody in that accident dies. Okay. So the rest of the story is that the gentleman who died had a high level of cocaine, and I can tell you exactly what his BAC is. I remember it to this day. It was 0.27.
Jesus.
And he had just come from a local tavern in Lafayette. It was a tavern that had a lot of slot machines. And because they had slot machines and there was a lot of cash being exchanged, they had cameras all over the place. Oh. And so the police traced it back. And on the camera, they found that the bartender had served this truck driver 10 rum and cokes again and again and again in 2 hours and 21 minutes. And it's all captioned on video. And I know in some of these dram shop cases, you have different bartenders. It's a very busy place. This was not a busy place. It was like you and me sitting across the bar. Here's another, here's another, here's another. So he was quite intoxicated, gets in the truck, and he causes all this to happen. So I represented the family against the guy that the estate of the fellow who had caused the accident. There was a big insurance coverage issue about that, on whether or not it was a commercial insurance policy, whether or not it was a scheduled truck. We ultimately prevailed and we got it. We got the full policy limits. And then there was this dram shop, and they had a dram shop policy. It wasn't a monster big policy, but it was important. Right. And now back to why this case stands out. It stands out because as a very young 29-year-old attorney, it was the first moment that I had really dealt with how do you work with clients who the most predominant feeling they have every moment is outraged grief. Yes. You know, not grief is certainly prevalent. Oh my gosh, we miss our daughter. We can't imagine the rest of our living lives. We're not going to have our daughter there. But also the part about this is so outrageous. How outrageous that this occurred. And so dealing with grief and dealing with outrage and trying to help them and feeling this. I mean, I'm a fairly emotional person myself. And so I'm not someone who easily compartmentalizes, oh, that's their feeling. That doesn't have to be my feeling. And so ultimately what happened, I should tell you as a part of the side story, is the bartender was charged with reckless endangerment. And he went to a jury trial and he was found guilty. And he served time in jail for several months for his reckless endangerment of serving again and again and again. Also, the father was quite an advocate, and he did a lot of lobbying for the state legislature. And he did two things out of that. One is he founded a company that had the breathalyzer lock and he helped develop a product, and he sold the product, and he went to a lot of courts. And so someone who has been found guilty or has otherwise pled guilty of a DUI, a lot of courts will impose that once you get your driver's license back, that before you can operate this, you have to blow into this breathalyzer that will then unlock your vehicle. So he was instrumental in starting a company like that, working with the courts, and I helped him some with that. And then also he got passed that there has to be bartender education now dealing with this, and that all arose out of that case. Ultimately, we brought a Dram Shop Act. I thought it was a particularly strong Dram Shop Act, especially with the guilty finding and having all this on film. Which, by the way, I now know that video cameras are kind of all over the place. Yeah. But in the 1990s, not so much. No. So that was really fortunate that we were able to find the video that helped build the case. It ultimately settled for the most that it could possibly settle for. 2020 did a whole story on the family, and they were involved and they were videoed. The local Indianapolis TV station that led into the 2020 episode came and they did a bunch of interviewing, including me. And so the point mostly on that case was, although it doesn't end up being a great trial story for me because we didn't have a jury trial, it really taught me a lot about working with clients on the parts that mattered with them. I was really privileged to be able to help them on some of the other aspects that they did. And it made me realize that sometimes, and they don't tell you this in law school, sometimes the case is not just about the complaint to the jury verdict. Sometimes it's about a lot of other stuff.
Right.
And I learned a lot from it.
And you can bring that into your mediations too.
I do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the point mostly on that is sometimes it's not about the money. Now, that's the famous phrase, right? When someone says it's not about the money, it's probably about the money.
Right.
Probably about the money, but not always about the money. And so I have certainly helped mediate cases that have involved resolutions that are more than just money. And I find that satisfying when we can do that.
Absolutely. So let's change gears a little bit. I mentioned that you coach a high school debate team. Tell me, and I think you already did tell me a little bit about why you're doing it. It seems to be a pretty passionate thing for you. So
right. So the backstory on this, it's Avon High School. My wife is a high school language arts and speech teacher at Avon High School. She originally taught at Owen Valley Middle School and then Brownsburg Junior High School. And then she took about 20 years off as we had our 3 kids. And she was busy doing all the things, raising them and being a stay-at-home mom. And then once we became empty nesters, she said, I really didn't love teaching. I'm not ready just to be done. So she renewed her license and did all the things necessary. She went back. She went right into the high school, which is about 10 minutes from where we live. And she kind of looked around and she said, well, this is different than what I grew up with. This is a very large high school, about 3,200 kids in the high school from 9 through 12. And Avon High School, like a lot of high schools, there's a lot of emphasis on sports, and there's certainly a lot of emphasis on music. A lot of the kids work, and there's some great vocational programs for those kids that have special needs. That's great. But boy, there's some other lanes here that a lot of kids seem lost with. And one of her passions has always been, we actually started dating through speech team, and she was also teaching speech, was we can do more with this speech team. At this point, there were about 10 students on the speech team. And they would go to a handful of tournaments a year. And she kind of felt like, boy, this is more that can be done. So she's coming home each night telling me about this. And what we agreed jointly to do is that she would become the head speech coach, and that Avon High School had never had a debate team, which is different. They're similar, and some of the same students do speech who also do debate, but they are different events, despite some of the similarities. And so she would be the head speech coach. I would be the head debate coach. Let's do this as a speech and debate team. Let's go. And we now have over 100 students between our speech and debate. And so in short, why do we do it? We do it because part of this is paying it forward. We got a lot out of it when we were in high school. We think it's a wonderful activity that will, the ability to be able to speak in public is so important. The ability to communicate one-on-one is so important. And COVID didn't help with any of that.
No.
And phones don't help with that either. Kids looking at their screens. And so we're sort of pushing some kids into some areas that might not be their comfort zone. And I think it's more important in 2024 than it probably ever has been. And so we want to provide an opportunity for students to really work on a life skill that many of them otherwise won't have exposure to until sometimes it's too late, their first job interview. And then finally, at a big high school, I think when people say, how can my child be successful at a big high school? They're a good student, they're not a great student. They're a good athlete, not a great athlete. They're a good musician, not a great musician. These are conversations that I have at the local coffee shop all the time. And what I say often is help them find a lane. Don't tell them where their lane is. Help them find a lane where they can be passionate, where they can do something a little bit different. I think it's great if it involves a team because with that comes collegiality. It comes esprit de corps that you can't get when you're off doing a solo activity. And speech and debate gives a lot of our students a lot of those kinds of ambitions and activities that they otherwise can't. So we practice throughout the week. Our meets are always on Saturdays. They're long days. We're often on a cold school bus on a January morning at 6 a.m. We often get back at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. There's competition. They have rounds. Sometimes they win. Sometimes they lose. Sometimes they're happy. Sometimes they're sad. Kind of like life,
Right.
But they're always improving. And we start the season in October and we end it in March. And where they started in March and where they ended up, or where they started in October and they ended up in March, is so exciting and gratifying for us.
Yeah. I saw the picture that you posted on Facebook. Over 100. There's probably more kids on the speech and debate team than on the football team. So.
Close. Yeah, probably. Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, I love that. So, so we also talked a little bit about your concert going experience. I wouldn't even call you an avid concert goer. You're a very experienced concert goer.
I might have an addiction.
Yeah.
To live music. It's true.
So, what if I asked you what's your favorite show you've ever seen? What show?
That is a hard question. It's almost like asking me to pick my favorite child. I love them all for different reasons, right? But a couple really stand out. One that comes to mind was Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, May of 2017. My dad, who had failing health, in January of 2017, had turned 75. The first concert I ever went to was 1984. It was the Cars. It was with my dad. And my dad and I he was a high school calculus teacher. Many ways we're different. In some ways, we had some similarities. One of the bonds we always had from teenage years up is we both like rock music, we both like live music, and we like it loud. Yeah. And so I have attended many concerts with my dad over the years. But in 2017, recognizing that his health was failing, and recognizing that perhaps he wouldn't be able to go to a lot more concerts, let alone with me, I paid a lot of extra money to get really good seats for Tom Petty and the Heartbreaker in May of 2017. Thinking to myself, maybe this would be the last concert experience that I have with my dad, so I want to make sure that it's special. And it really was. Tom was perfect. Joe Walsh was the opener. He was very good, but the band never sounded better. And I've probably seen Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers at that point probably 8 times, going back to the Indianapolis Tennis Center in 1985. That was the first time I ever saw him. I thought he was a supreme singer, musician, songwriter. I think his vibe on stage was always great. Yeah. Somewhere between manic and chill, which is kind of difficult, but kind of depended on the moment. And the Heartbreakers, I mean, I could go on and on about all the talent with those folks. So it was a magical night. It had rained all day, and then the weather had cleared, and it was a perfect May night. What I didn't realize, I realized in the moment this is really great. My dad and I taking this experience in like we had for decades, that this was special. What I didn't, of course, know was that Tom Petty was going to die on October 2, 2017. So less than 5 months later, he would be dead, and that would be the last time I ever saw Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Notwithstanding all of the emotional aspects of this now as I look back on it, just the moment was great too. Yeah. He had energy. We had energy as the crowd. It was really a special night.
Yeah, he does. He puts on a great show. I saw him in the early 2010s, maybe 2011, something like that. He really does a great job. So favorite venue to watch a concert?
It's really tough to beat Red Rocks out in Morrison, Colorado, just west of Denver. I had known about Red Rocks for years. It was a bucket list item. I've now seen 4 concerts at Red Rocks, and I'm not done yet. I absolutely love it. For those who aren't super familiar with Red Rocks is a geological wonder. As I mentioned, it's just west of Denver. So you're looking at the Rocky Mountains on one side. You're looking at the city of Denver on another side. It's elevated. There are these rocks that truly are red that sit on both sides and form a perfect amphitheater. It only seats about 9,400 people. There's also a visitor center, which is an amazing museum to Red Rocks and all the acts that have come through there. The acoustics are perfect. The weather in the summer in Colorado is almost always perfect. And you can just tell that the musicians are treating it like this is a different kind of place, and we're going to bring our best.
Right. Yeah. The Red Rock's been around since 1900.
It's amazing, isn't it?
That's crazy.
I mean, there were vaudeville acts that used to be there.
Right? Yeah. I've been there. I've seen a show. Everything you said is 100% accurate.
You know, one interesting little trivia that I picked up from being at the Visitor Center. We all are aware of the Beatles tour that started in 1964 and went over into 65 a little bit. The Beatles sold out everywhere. Shea Stadium, of course, is one of the most famous Beatles concerts. So every place they went, they sold out. The one venue they did not sell out on that tour was Red Rocks, which is kind of amazing because it's really not that big of a place. You can sell out Shea Stadium, but you can't sell out a 9,400 person venue. And you know, I think mostly it was because Denver wasn't that well developed. It was the West. They really didn't care about these 4 kids with mop heads from Britain. It was a cow town, you know, and so they just did the Beatles vibe really just hadn't hit Denver like it hit other parts of North America.
Yeah, that's funny. What are maybe 1 or 2 local bands that you would recommend people go see a live show?
Well, you know, there are a lot of growing. There's a music vibe in Indianapolis. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's like Los Angeles or even Minneapolis or anything like that. But one of my former law partners is a fellow by the name of Craig Helmerich, and he has his own band, and it's called It's Just Craig. And he has played at the Hi-Fi, which is in the Fountain Square area. And Craig does a really nice job. He's got a couple albums that are out. And Craig is a big supporter of some of the local artists. So I guess I would do a big shout out for Craig. I also will say, you know, that there are some other interesting venues. But I mean, we all know Ruoff, or as some of the old schoolers will still call it Deer Creek, including me. Yep. White River is an amazing amphitheater.
It is.
It's one of the best, for my money, it's probably the best place to see a concert. The Vogue has been around forever, and they'll bring in some fun acts. The Palladium up in Carmel for acoustics, it's tough to beat. Yeah. But don't sleep on places like Garfield Park. Garfield Park in the last couple of years have been hosting music festivals. Garfield Park is a gorgeous park.
Yeah.
They do a terrific job. They call it Wonder Road Festival, and they've done it in June for the last couple of years. They've brought in some pretty big acts like Jason Isbell and Weezer.
Yep.
And so that's a good place. I mentioned Hi-Fi previously. Hi-Fi is in Fountain Square. They do also something called the Hi-Fi Annex, which is just the parking lot behind Hi-Fi. They do that in the summer. Yeah. Speaking of local acts, they're actually based in Chicago, but they might as well be based in Indianapolis and Bloomington because they play here so much. It's called Rod Tough Curls and the Bench Press, which is sort of a funny name. Yeah. But it's a cover band that is just absolutely fantastic. To me, concerts are about the vibe.
Right.
And do you have more energy being there and leaving than you came with. And if it is, then I usually give a thumbs up to that concert. And they're one of those bands that are really great for that extra kind of vibe.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned the White River State Park. I saw the Beach Boys, Earth, Wind and Fire, and the Temptations there.
How about it?
That was an awesome show.
That's very old school of you, Alex.
It was.
Yeah.
I took my father-in-law and mother-in-law, but it was a great show, you know. Not many original members left, but, you know, still a great show.
Well, I think some of those bands you mentioned, they have these huge, large piece bands, you know, and let's hear it for horns.
Right.
You know, when you can bring horns in, you know, you get the saxophones and the trumpets and the trombones. I think that pushes the vibe up. I love those kinds of concerts.
Yeah. That, and then we were talking about Deer Creek. I saw Journey, but with the new singer.
Yeah.
He did great.
Yeah, he's very good.
Yes.
Yeah, a YouTube sensation that then became the lead singer of Journey.
Yeah, right.
There's hope for you and me. We just got to get on YouTube.
That's funny. So another thing we talked about, you do some stand-up comedy.
I do.
You do. Let's talk a little bit about that. You've done shows locally. Where at?
Well, mostly at Helium is the place that I have primarily done it. I will also tell you, I'll shout out back to my Newcastle homies. I did a half-hour set for my 35th high school class reunion at the Eagles Lodge in Newcastle.
Nice.
There's a place in Lafayette that I frequent a lot. It's called Aces. There's another place in Lafayette that's called Lefties that I haven't done yet that I will certainly be. Helium, for those of you who aren't aware, is in Circle Center Mall in Indianapolis. They do open mic just about every week, not quite every week, but just about every week. And that's a really great format. They also do something called Indiana's Funniest Comic, which is a competition they do once a year, and they give you extra time. On February 10, I will be doing a 10-minute set at the Vogue as part of the Indianapolis Bar Foundation's Indies Got Talent. So that'll be a lot of fun. I'll try to fine tune and you know, one of the interesting parts about whether you're an attorney trying a case, you're doing speech and debate, you're speaking to a public group, or finally being a stand-up comedy, you're just trying to relate. Yeah. You're just trying to say, this is important to me. This is something that I find persuasive, something that I think matters. This is something I find funny.
Yeah.
But what you're trying to say is, hey, audience, maybe you will too. But you've got to find that base where we can all kind of figure it out. And so one of the parts I like about doing stand-up comedy is, number one, while I love music, I'm not a musician. While I like art a lot, I'm not particularly artistic. And so I'm always looking, just like most people, we're looking for ways to have creative outlets. And to me, writing comedy and delivering comedy and trying to get funnier with my delivery is a form of art that's fun to do. And I like working on that. And I hope I get laughs in the process, but candidly, the process is almost more important than do I get the laughs or not. Now, usually I do, but I get a big kick out of it. I also, probably like a musician, you have a way of, once you start producing your own music, writing your own music, you can go and look at other people who do that, and you can kind of see what the craft behind it. And I think actually doing stand-up comedy has helped me become a better evaluator on who's funny, of the big names that we know. And more importantly than who's funny, why are they funny?
Yeah.
And a couple things I've learned, and I'll tell you one piece of advice that I would give attorneys, that I give debaters, and then I give stand-up comics is that it's about the specific. Specificity always matters. There's a lot of people out there that speak in generalities, right? And I'm going to be pejorative here, pablum. They're just sort of like, that's the way it goes. It is what it is. Or they tell something that they think is funny, and maybe it is in their mind, but it's not, because they just didn't get specific. A very easy example. So I saw this guy and I kicked him. Okay, well, is that funny? Not necessarily. So I saw this guy and I gave him a piece of my hokas. Suddenly what? That was funnier because you said hokas, and now I can visualize. Same thing with debate. If you want to bang on the table and talk about why you're going to win, you have to provide it with specific evidence, specific anecdotes, specific examples. Yes. At trial, if you want to win, if you're a plaintiff's attorney and you want to talk about why your client's life has been changed because they have a traumatic brain injury, don't just say it. Don't just put the images on there. Don't just bring the neuropsychologist to talk about the testing results. You have to talk about, but how has this changed your Tuesdays? How has it changed your Tuesday mornings?
Right.
Specifics always win. And I think that's true in all the various fields that we've talked about.
Absolutely. So do you prepare your stand-up comedy similar to how you prepared your closing arguments?
Probably. I haven't never thought about it, but I'm still the same person. I still have the same brain, and I guess I still have the same thought process on how you prepare.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do. But the number one thing that I think is similar is, well, two things I would guess. One is, what am I saying is relevant and important and persuasive to my audience, whether they're the audience out in the Helium Comedy Club or they're sitting in a jury box. Who cares what I think? What do they think?
Right.
So you got to really get your mindset around what would they find interesting and important and persuasive. And then the next, word choice matters.
Yes.
This word, not that word. And I'm constantly editing. That's a funnier word than that. And I think that's important to do also as a lawyer, because the difference between this word and that word can mean everything. Are you cold or are you frigid? Are you hot, or are you absolutely about to faint? It's just that extra little phraseology brings something home in a way that the pablum simply won't.
Exactly. And I think that's a great piece of advice for anyone that wants to, whether you're delivering a joke as a stand-up comedian or a closing argument, right? Yeah. We talked about some of your travels, going places. You're a pretty active guy. What's your favorite place to kind of spend time outdoors, go hiking, do things like that?
I mentioned Colorado previously because of Red Rocks. I really enjoy Colorado. I'm not a very good snow skier as a flatlander. I'll forever be an average skier. I don't think at age 55 I'm about to change that anytime soon. So I enjoy winter sports, snowmobiling, snowshoeing, downhill skiing. But the part of Colorado that I probably love the most is summertime in Colorado.
Oh, yeah.
When it's 77 degrees and zero humidity and the air is crisp. Not just in the morning, but throughout the day, whitewater rafting, hiking, bicycling through the aspen groves. That's all really tough to be.
Really? Yeah. What you mentioned Avon. I go through Avon quite a bit, place out at Heritage Lake. What is the best restaurant in Avon?
Opus. Opus is a Greek restaurant. It's our go-to.
Yeah.
I really, really like Opus. There's another one, the Cunningham Restaurant Group, which is certainly well chronicled and well known. Well, Mike Cunningham lived in Avon for a long time. He was actually a neighbor of mine. And so he started the current Cunningham Restaurant Group, as we all understand, with two restaurants in Hendricks County. One was in Brownsburg. It was then and is now Boulder Creek. And then there's one in Avon that's called Charbonneau's. And Charbonneau's is really good, and it's the beginnings of Cunningham Restaurant Group. And when you go, their menu is terrific. It's always changing. Mike Cunningham, for his many, many talents, one of them that probably gets understated is the ambiance that he has by virtue of choosing that kind of wall and that kind of flooring and that kind of decoration. And Charbonneau's has a lot of that. So Opus and Charbonneau's are my two go-tos.
Yeah, I'll have to try. I've got to try both of them. My neighbor out at the lake, he swears by Charbonneau's. It's amazing. What about Indianapolis? Best restaurant in Indianapolis?
Boy, there's so many great ones, right? I mean, I don't eat steak often, but when I do eat steak, it's tough not to be thinking about downtown Indianapolis and St. Elmo's. I suppose if you asked most people in my demographic, they would often say St. Elmo's and Ruth's Chris. And so I like ocean air. I mean, I'm a big seafood person. Yeah. And when I talk to, people from Florida or from Maine or friends that I have throughout the nation, and I start talking about this really good seafood restaurant in Indianapolis, they look at me like, what are you talking about?
Right.
You're in the Midwest. How good could it be? but it's really good.
It is. It is. And I will tell you, I am a native Floridian. If it swims, crawls, or floats in the ocean, I will eat it. Absolutely. And ocean air, they're actually right downstairs, right below us in this building there. It really, I went in there with my in-laws the first time and I was like, it's not going to be as good as they're saying. And it really was. I mean, it really is fantastic. So what's next for Mike Langford?
Well, that's a great question. I hope more of the same. And I don't say that as a matter of trying to be lazy. I just really enjoying my current place in life, which includes mediation. I thoroughly enjoy it. I am being a debate coach with these young high school minds and helping them improve, but also, and I didn't mention this before, Avon High School is one of these suburban Indianapolis high schools that probably people think they know what it's about. But if you go in the high school, most people probably would know that it is now 44% non-white. And out of that 44%, a very large percentage are recent immigrants. We have a lot of particularly Nigerian families that have moved into Avon, Ethiopian, Moroccan, Kenyan. We certainly have Korean, Chinese, and it is a vibe and a demographic that excites me as a middle-aged. Can I say middle-aged when I'm 55? That would suggest I'm going to live to 110. That probably is a little audacious on my part. But anyway, I'll continue to use the demographic as long as I can get away with it. As a middle-aged white man who has lived in Indiana his entire life, I will just say to me that Indiana's immigration patterns are exciting to me.
Right.
I am super excited by anybody who wants to come to our country. They're thrilled to be here. They say, this is the place for me. I want to bring energy. I want to bring culture that is perhaps different. And I'm so much better for it. Yeah. And so it's very exciting to see some of my debate students. They weren't speaking English until 5 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And now they're doing moral, political philosophy debates, something called Lincoln Douglas debate, in the English language. A lot of their parents don't speak English, or they don't speak much English, and they're not regularly speaking English at home. And yet they transition and they come into Avon where we're all speaking English, and they're performing at very high levels. And every time I'm on one of those cold school buses, I'm always the guy trying, hey, don't fall asleep. I got things I want to hear about, what's going on in Nigeria right now.
Yeah.
And so I'm all the better for it. And so that excites me too. Back to your question. So what's the future of I hope I continue to mediate for as long as people will continue to hire me. I hope that I can stay involved with young folks and continue to learn new aspects that they can bring to me. I think that's great. I've always been a big reader. I hope I'm a better reader going forward. I hope I expand and read more things that I probably are outside of my usual comfort zone. I'm never going to be Jerry Seinfeld, but I like to get better at stand-up comedy because it's always fun to do things better than where you thought you could go. So all my children are all in their 20s. They're all having nice lives and doing their things, but hopefully marriages and grandchildren for me, children for them will be in the fold.
Good. If anyone wants to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
Well, they can certainly email me at any point. My email address is mlangford, that's MLANGFORD, at mediate.com. Mediate spelled a little differently. It's MEDE, the number 8.com. And I'll give you my phone number. No problem. Anybody can call me, 317-908-8138. You can find my bio at mediate.com.
Great. And you are mediating across the country, right?
I am, right. Yeah, I from time to time, I am privileged that folks call me and they say, we've got a big case, and I just mediated a very large case in Arizona, New Mexico several times, Florida, Ohio, Illinois. Sure.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you for being on the show.
It's been my privilege. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks,
Great.
Alex.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for listening to Circle City Conversations podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more future conversations.